Warm welcome everyone to today's Boardroom Bites at 9. Our topic for this morning is linking executive pay to organizational purpose. And today is actually one of the IoDSA's Remuneration Committee Forum paper launches. We've produced this paper during the course of this year, and we're taking this opportunity this morning to officially launch our paper. So this morning we've got Ronel and Tim, who are both part of our Remuneration Committee Forum. Ronel is the chair of our forum, and Tim's one of our members, and he's also one of our specialist facilitators at the IoDSA. Both have got extensive experience in the remuneration field and in REM governance, and are both seen as specialists in this area. So I'm going to hand over to Ronel to talk a bit more about the forum and to start off our session. So Ronel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vicky, for that introduction, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome at this morning's webinar on this fascinating topic of linking pay to organizational performance. It certainly is for me an absolute honor to be joined by Tim Anderson this morning. Tim is the lead author of Paper 10, which we will be launching this morning, as Vicky has said, and which we are very excited about, a whole new field for the reward fraternity. Both of us represent the IoD's Remuneration Committee Forum, that provides an important and a valuable service, we believe, to its members by researching and disseminating information on developments that relate to remuneration committee and governance issues in particular. And we do that through regular meetings, workshops, and when appropriate, through publications as this one this morning. There are 19 members in the forum. I quickly saw Elizabeth Kamalo also dialing in this morning. She's also a member of our forum. I'm sure there's some of the others as well that are dialing in. And 9 publications have been issued by the forum over the past few years. These are all available on the IoD's website, and they are aimed at supporting remuneration committee members, other board members, HR and reward executives with relevant reward-related information. I'm going to introduce the topic today with a short overview and a short introduction of what it is about, and thereafter Tim will provide you with some highlights on the content of the latest forum paper. The paper will also be provided on the website after the session. This should take us approximately 40 minutes, and thereafter you are very welcome to post the questions on the Q&A line, which Vicky has just demonstrated. So let's start with what do we mean by organizational purpose? And the easy answer is that there is no common definition of org purpose. I have included 3 different quotations on my next slide, which I thought capture most of the prevalent elements of org purpose. The first quotation on the screen, if you can just move the slides to me, Vicky, thank you, is by Valerie Keller. And Valerie says, we are now seeing another evolution, a new breed of companies who are not just purpose-driven themselves, but are innovating and collaborating. Sustainability is now business hygiene. And individual companies can't do it alone. They have to be able to collaborate. The new frontier of business is for those who are leading on the transformation of their industry. It is no more just about their company. It is now also about the industry. Sustainability is also a key word in this particular quotation and is often used synonymously with purpose. Then leaders on purpose define purpose as the ambition to create value by contributing to the welfare of society. Their definition is deliberately vague, as no 2 companies are the same, and therefore no 2 companies will have the same purpose. And then finally, the US Business Roundtable that represents 180 CEOs of the largest organizations in the USA have committed to lead their companies for the benefit of all stakeholders, customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and shareholders. These are all the stakeholders that should benefit from the being of a company. And why do organizations want to adopt a purpose? As it has also now been proven scientifically that when organizations focus beyond profit and they instill a strong sense of purpose among their employees, that they are significantly more likely to find long-term success. But we are not presenting on purpose today, but on how we can use remuneration to incentivize and motivate the delivery of an organization's purpose. So the question is, why is it important to put the spotlight specifically on the remuneration angle, other than obviously it's the right thing to do? On the next slide, we have clips from 4 recently published articles where shareholder activists are starting to use the vote on the remuneration policy and on other shareholder resolutions as a mechanism to focus the attention on purpose-related matters. Share Action had recommended to their investors to vote against the remuneration policy that were considered at Shell's AGM in May this year on the grounds that it incentivizes further extraction and burning of fossil fuels. The same group also recommended that shareholders abstain from BP's pay policy, which was tabled at their AGM earlier this year, as, according to them, the policy lacked how performance will be measured in the context of the energy transition. Both climate-related matters. Old Mutual and Just Share are standing together advising shareholders to vote against remuneration policies where there is not adequate attention on closing the pay gap, addressing the inequality issue, which is certainly part of the definition of sustainability and therefore also linked to purpose. Internal equity and other sustainability matters are monstrous problems in South Africa and in the rest of the world, and it is clear that the vote on the remuneration policy will become the target for shareholders where companies do not adequately address these matters. On the next slide, I've included an example of the 2020 BP incentive target. So this is now post their 2019 AGM. And this structure includes an example of a company that has included safety, environment, operational performance, and financial performance in their scorecards on the long-term and the short-term incentive plans. So on the surface of it, most of the components of sustainability and of purpose have therefore been addressed. And many stakeholders certainly are being addressed through this scorecard. So it looks like a perfectly balanced scorecard. But the question is whether this is going to be good enough. And on this note, Tim, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronel. Thanks for that introduction. And good morning, everybody. Vicky, would you put on the first slide? Okay. So when companies rely on short-term profitability to grow their share price, they're often forced to meet their targets to cut essential expenditure on items like training, maintenance, and research and development, as well as capital investments needed for future growth. The only people who benefit from this are speculative shareholders who make a quick profit when they sell their shares, and those executives whose incentives are weighted towards short-term financial performance. Everybody else loses: employees, customers, suppliers, savers, pensioners, and society at large. And the impacts of this short-term mindset are easy to see, as Ronel mentioned, growing inequality and job insecurity around the world. And secondly, damage to the environment, as exhibited by the extreme man-made weather conditions we've witnessed recently: droughts, heat waves, floods, and fires. But society is no longer willing to put up with this, and the demands for business to be a force for good in society are growing. In a recent survey of millennials, more said improving society was a more important objective for companies than generating profit. Another survey showed that the majority of respondents believe that capitalism in its current form is doing more harm than good in the world. This pressure from society is causing boards and executives to rethink how they define performance, very importantly how they achieve it, and what executives are rewarded for. Businesses and institutional investors are taking note. The Business Roundtable, which, as Ronel mentioned, represents some 180 of the US's largest corporations, recently updated its statement on the purpose of a corporation. And this statement, which is issued regularly, has always focused on shareholder primacy, but the updated version now commits its members to create value for all stakeholders and not just shareholders. Similarly, BlackRock, an influential institutional investor with some $7 trillion of assets under management, $7 trillion, stresses the importance of creating value for all stakeholders as a prerequisite for sustainable shareholder value, and for companies to be responsible custodians for climate change. Some institutional investors and sovereign funds have gone so far as to start filtering out of their portfolios companies that they believe are causing damage to society or the environment. So in summary, there are two issues at the root of the problem that we've described. The first is short-termism, where companies care more about immediate profits, and immediate profits can be this year's profits or even this quarter, than they do about the sustainability of the company. And the second is an excessive focus on shareholder returns. Of these two, we believe that short-termism is the more serious, because when companies focus on long-term shareholder returns, they are forced to consider the needs and expectations of their stakeholders. It's simply not possible to grow your share price sustainably if your employees, customers, suppliers, and society at large are unhappy. Vicky, would you put up the second slide? So, to achieve this broadening of perspective, companies are being encouraged to state their purpose, which really is, what do they exist to do? How will they create financial value over the long term with a clear recognition of all drivers of this value, both financial and non-financial? And also to state and quantify how all of their stakeholders, not just their shareholders, will benefit. Now, it's important that the purpose statement is more than just a tagline. It should have real substance. It should be the focal point for an organization's strategies, performance metrics, and incentives. Okay, so the question then is, how should a company express its purpose outcomes, and how should it measure them? Now, this is a job for the whole board to consider. Remco then decides which of the purpose metrics should be included in its long and short-term incentive schemes. Vicky, would you put up the poll question, please? Okay, so the question I want to ask is, for a for-profit company, do you feel that long-term financial performance sufficiently captures the company's purpose? And just yes or no.
Tim, I'm just giving it a few seconds because I see some are not seeing the poll. You should see the poll on your screen. I think if you're joining using your phone, the poll may not show up. So that might be, so Charles mentioned that he couldn't see the questions. But if you're dialing in from your computer, you should see the polls on your screen. It looks like everybody has pretty much answered. They've stopped, so I'm going to end the poll now and share for you, Tim.
Okay. Right. Okay, so that's interesting. So about 42% of those people who replied believe that long-term financial performance is a good proxy for company's purpose. But more feel that it's not. Okay, so this is not a straightforward question, and there's a lot of controversy around it. And really, there are two different viewpoints that you can find in the literature and in what companies are saying. And again, I'm talking about a for-profit company. So the first viewpoint is to express purpose in terms of growing the long-term financial value of the company, and to consider all other forms of stakeholder value as essential drivers of this outcome. Now, this view is generally supported by institutional investors whose ultimate responsibility is to manage and grow the funds entrusted to them by pension funds and individual savers. For them, satisfying the needs of stakeholders is important, but it's more of a means than an end. And it's interesting, just yesterday, I was reading that this current draft legislation in the US, put out by the Department of Labor, to prohibit pension funds from making investments in ESG vehicles, that's environmental, social, and governance vehicles, unless these can be shown to be for the purpose of enhancing returns or mitigating risks for the fund. In other words, investments made by pension funds to promote social good per se will not be allowed under this legislation if it goes through. And I want to ask you the question, as an investor whose retirement well-being is tied up in a pension fund, how do you feel about it? What do you believe that that pension fund's objectives should be? Anyway, it's an open question. Now, the second viewpoint considers all forms of stakeholder value as desired outcomes in their own right, without anyone having primacy over the others. Now, this view leads to a number of practical difficulties for boards who need a way to manage conflicting stakeholder claims. I want to give you 3 examples of these conflicts. Okay, the first one is, on what basis should a company choose to invest in technology that increases profitability and competitiveness, which is obviously good for the shareholders, it's good for the company, and it's good for the country as a whole, but leads to job losses, which is obviously negative for employees? Or if I were to put that the other way around, should a company use labor-intensive processes to create jobs, even if this reduces profitability and competitiveness? The second conflict is, should a company spend money on recycling initiatives that reduce profitability, which is clearly negative for shareholders, but protect the environment, which is positive for society? And how do you get the right balance between the two? And the last conflict is, should a company buy its raw materials and inputs from local suppliers, even if these result in higher input costs and reduce competitiveness? And our contention is that if you haven't got an overriding objective, it's very difficult to make these choices, because you have to make a call that one type of stakeholder may be important, more important than another. And on what basis would you make that statement? So in our paper, we've proposed a practical way of dealing with this issue. It's really a sort of a middle ground. And in essence, it says, for for-profit companies, that the primary objective should be to grow the financial value of the company over the longer term. Now, to me, this makes sense, but because a company that is financially weak or failing benefits nobody. All stakeholders lose when a company fails. The next step is to decide how much of each type of stakeholder value should be created in order to achieve the financial growth target of the company, and how these forms of value should be expressed. This is not easy. It requires a good deal of judgment from the board and executives in answering questions like, what do our different categories of stakeholders expect? What can we realistically deliver? At what cost? Over what time frame? And what will be the impact on the value of the organization of delivering that stakeholder value? Now, there's quite a lot of guidance, and we refer to this in our paper, guidance from institutions such as the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, the Global Reporting Initiative, and others. And boards, and particularly Remcos, need to be familiar with these. Getting that balance right between different forms of stakeholder value and their connection with the valuation of the company in the long term requires a detailed knowledge of the company its competitors, and its industry. Now, our sort of compromise is, regardless of the contribution to creating financial value, all organizations are expected to deliver at least a minimum amount of value to their stakeholders. This is simply part of being a good corporate citizen. So all organizations should, to a greater or lesser extent, set metrics for, manage and report on material sustainability issues such as how they care for the environment, such as recycling initiatives and reduction of CO2 emissions and water usage, how many jobs and entrepreneurs they have developed in their value chain, what their investments in employee training and development have been, improvements in gender and racial diversity, and good governance. Those are the things that at least a minimum level of performance, at least of those things, is required from all organizations, even if some of these appear to come just at a short-term cost with no direct impact on the financial value of the organization in the short term. These are things that organizations are expected to do. Now, metrics and targets should be developed for the different forms of stakeholder value created. And at present, all companies do this in a variety of ways. And if you read integrated reports of the top integrated reports in the country, you'll see there's a huge difference in ways they do this. But there's a push, and we referred to some of the papers, there's a push to get companies to report in their integrated reports in a consistent way so that comparisons can be made between them. Institutional investors and regulators are pushing hard for this. And it's interesting that there's a draft EU directive on the standardization of non-financial reporting across all companies in the EU. Now, one paper that we've referred to in our paper categorizes these different forms of stakeholder value as financial, human, customer, and societal. And I see the table is up, Vicky, thank you. So I want to give some examples of metrics using this categorization. Okay, so under financial, you'd find the normal sort of metrics that you find in most companies and in many incentive schemes as well. Things like revenue growth, earnings per share growth, return on capital employed. There could also be others like Ebitda. There could be EBITDA margins. There could be a cash flow measure. There could be working capital measures. There are many of those, and those are quite well known. Now, under human, how do you express human value created? And as I said, the GRA and other organizations list commonly used metrics, and they give guidance on how those metrics should be calculated. But it would be things like retention of key employees is an indication of the creation of human capital. It could be employee engagement rating. It could be the number of females in senior management ranks. Under customer, you could measure customer value created in terms of customer satisfaction ratings, key customer retention, innovation, the revenues that you are generating from new products, in other words, the degree that your customers have taken on those, and societal, the number of jobs that you've created in the supply chain or in the value chain, the reduction of CO2 emissions, supplier diversity. Now, there's a view in this one paper that we've referred to that these four categories of stakeholder value sufficiently capture the value that you're creating for all stakeholders and which also contribute to long-term financial growth in the organization. And what companies should do is they should develop metrics for these, and I've given some there, and again, you can refer to the papers. The metrics should be verifiable, obviously, so they can reassure shareholders and stakeholders. And targets should be set for each of the important ones in your context at a threshold, target, and stretch level. So now we're moving from just saying, yes, we believe that employees are our most valuable asset, but we're actually putting down metrics to demonstrate how we're going to measure the actual human capital that we've created. Vicky, would you put up the last slide, slide 4? And then the next step, of course, is to link your short and long-term incentives to selected outcomes and drivers listed above to create alignment between purpose and incentives. And at the moment, that's I would say, quite a big negative. If one looks at the integrated reports of many of the leading companies in South Africa and elsewhere, you'll see that their strategy contains very much of what we've said. They talk about customer value, stakeholder value, all sorts of things. But when you come to the incentive schemes, the metrics are pretty much financial. And that is part of the discussion. One of the companies that we refer to made a very clear point that they recognize that all of these factors that we've discussed are important, but the only thing you need to measure is the long-term financial performance of the organization, because you will not achieve long-term financial performance if you haven't also at the same time done these things that we're referring to. It's a controversy that still hasn't been fully answered. Now, there's a view that performance-driven incentive metrics should be de-emphasized in favor of long-term share awards, again, for a for-profit company. And really, there are two reasons for this. Remco's often experienced problems in selecting the right short-term metrics. And if you look at the GRI, there are probably dozens and dozens of pages of suggested metrics that companies can use. And it's very difficult to make a choice. So Remco's often experienced problems selecting the right short-term metrics, those that will have the greatest impact on the value of the organization over time. The cause and effect relationships between stakeholder value and organizational value can be complex and even obscure. And Remco members often don't have the knowledge or experience to challenge the executives on these. And unfortunately, executives can sometimes choose stakeholder metrics that may be relatively easy to achieve and therefore earn bonuses, but don't necessarily land up increasing the value of the organization in the longer term. And of course, setting targets. You know, how do you set a target for employee engagement? What's the right level? Again, guidance is given, but it's definitely not a straightforward issue. But despite what I've just said, the inclusion of selected metrics in that table above signals to executives what the board and Remco believe are important. And very importantly too, it explains to stakeholders in the integrated report how they believe that long-term financial value is created. There's an organization that does a rating of integrated reports. And this, in fact, is one of the factors that comes up quite often, is that there isn't sufficient clarity on the connection, the cause and effect relationship between stakeholder value created and the long-term financial value of the organization. And they recommend that employees think more about that. And then in terms of long-term incentives, there's a view that the only long-term incentive should be a significant shareholding by executives in the shares of their company. That's the only thing that you need. Again, because it's so difficult to set metrics for long-term and short-term incentives, that executives should be required to build significant shareholdings. And this can be done through signing on awards, previously vested long-term incentives, and the conversion of short-term cash incentives into shares. And the view of this organization, which again we've referred to in our paper, is that shares should be released for sale on a phased basis of periods not less than 5 to 7 years, with part of the shareholding requirement applying for 2 to 3 years after leaving the organization. And the block release of shares should not be triggered by any defined event, such as retirement. Okay, that really, Vicky and Ronel, covers what I was going to say. We do at the Institute of Directors run a course on remuneration governance, effective remuneration committees. And if you have a look at the IoD's website, you'll get details on that. And obviously that delves into everything we said in much, much more detail. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Ronel, if you would like to put your video on, and then we'll move into our Q&A session. For our attendees, if you have any questions, please put that in the Q&A box, or if you would like to ask your question live, please raise your hand. You'll see there is a button that says raise your hand, and I will then unmute you and allow you to ask your question. Ronel and Tim, we've got a few questions at the moment. So while I wait for more questions to arrive, I'll start with the first one. And it says, with the table, this was a table that you put up with the metrics, Tim. Would this be different per industry? So example, would a technology company potentially be very different from an energy provider?
Should I answer that one now?
Yes, you can, Tim.
Yes, it would be. Those were just examples. And as I said, if you were to go and look at some of the papers referred to, like the GRI, in their appendices, first of all, they categorize their stakeholder value in slightly different ways. But when they talk about human value created, for example, they give, I would say, dozens and dozens, maybe even 50 or 100 different metrics that you could use. And your board and your remuneration committee needs to look at those and decide which is the most appropriate. One company that I used to work for did this extremely well. And what they did is, when they were looking at the options for what they call their sustainable development initiatives, they would put together a detailed narrative on it. And that narrative, which could be 3 or 4 or 5 pages long, justifies the reasons why they've chosen a particular metric. It forces them to think through, why is it appropriate? How does it contribute to the long-term value of the company in their particular circumstances? And it also, because those narratives were made available to stakeholders in the integrated report or on the website, it explains to stakeholders how this company proposes to create value in the long term. So writing a narrative is also a very good way of introducing more rigor into the thought process.
Thanks.
Okay.
Another question from Khuliswa, and Tim Ronel, I'm not sure who would like to answer this one, is how do you reward for performance given those proposed solutions? So the solutions that you put forward, Tim, the bar has been set regarding executive pay. What are your thoughts? What thoughts are circulating on being able to attract top talent in companies in the future?
Okay, rewarding, how to reward for performance, giving these solutions. We've given some examples in our paper. Okay, so first of all, in terms of setting the strategy, the board would look at the key value drivers of its purpose objectives, and then remuneration committee would have a look at the key metrics in that strategy and use those to tie mostly to the short-term incentives of the organization. And in the paper, we've given some examples of that.
Thanks.
I think if I can add to that as well, Vicky, is retention and attraction is a matter which is not only addressed by reward. Marcus Buckingham famously said that companies leave managers, but employees leave managers but join companies, and it is around a very broad employee value proposition. And I think more and more what we see now is that employees who can, so we're not talking about employees who don't have a choice where they want to work, but employees who have a choice and can choose between companies where they would like to work. In fact, more and more are starting to look for organizations with this clear sense of purpose. As Tim also said in his work, is that it is far more than just reward that now attracts employees. It is around a sense of purpose, it's around a sense of wanting to join companies that are there also for the broader good of society. And reward is obviously important because money makes the world go round, and you can't not have a good reward strategy. But it is also important that we understand what it is that attracts and retains our top talent and what we then need to do to address those matters.
Okay.
Thanks, Ronel. Charles has his hand up. So Charles, I'm going to unmute you and let you ask your question live. So if you can just unmute your mic, please.
Super. Thank you very much for the presentations. My question is around the recruitment process for executives. So there are a lot of sort of cognitive process profiles and assessments that take place. And my experience is, they'll go up to 5-6 hours, the different chunks that you have to do in order to sort of go through the interview process. And you'll probably find out of that 5 hours, maybe 20 minutes, maximum 30 minutes looks at your personality. And even that personality review is restricted to maybe where you best fit. Are you suited to sales or maybe a background analytical sort of role? So my point is that from what I've seen, there's very little sort of questions around what your core values are, what your perspectives around ethics are. And with these failures around focus or whether overemphasizing on monetary issues versus the stakeholder sort of broader values, they are heavily linked to a person's value set and what they prioritize. So I guess my question is, or rather my request is, could you comment a little bit about that and maybe the effect it has and how it can be remedied? Because I think it is material. So at the end, they end up recruiting people who will naturally overemphasize the monetary sort of analytical, everything's focusing on the numbers mostly. Yeah, thank you. I hope I managed to articulate it well enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. Ronel, anyone wants to tackle that?
So let me start, and then Tim, you're welcome to chip in. Charles, you're so absolutely right. And I think that is also why we saw this very interesting split this morning in the poll from Tim, the 40 to 58% split, which is actually quite borderline, is that there is still a majority of people that think that financial performance is perhaps the most important overriding component of organizational success over the long term. And as Tim has mentioned, that is critical and it's a starting point. But because if you're not financially successful, then none of the others matters will in fact follow. The question is, how do we bring that balance? And you've raised that question. And my view is that it starts with the board. The board needs to start by laying down the directive in terms of what is it that they expect from the executive from a performance perspective. So in terms of the performance agreement that they set with the CEO, with the CFO, with the directors, the prescribed officers, so where is the balance? And that it is not just predominantly driven by financial performance. So it's important and it's critical, but it's not the only measure that they should drive. And I think if the board doesn't set the standard, you're going to actually struggle to get that through the organization. Tim?
Yeah, just Charles, what you were saying earlier, and I'm just looking at a couple of questions. I think a big part of the problems in getting pay for performance right is that Remco members often don't understand performance. They don't have a full view of what performance measures are relevant in driving the purpose objectives of a company. And it's pretty difficult if you think about it. A Remco member doesn't spend an awful lot of time in the organization, but has to understand the company, its value drivers, the industry, what competitors are doing, what regulators and legislators around the world are thinking, what pressures are being put on them by their institutional shareholders, and it just goes on and on and on. And one of our Remco papers we put out, I think it was the last one, and I think it was called something like the 10 questions that Remco members should be asking themselves. And one of the things described the ideal Remco member, and it looked at an ideal Remco member in terms of the attributes of that person, in terms of things like, what do you know? Yes. What have you done? In other words, your experiences, but very importantly also who you are. What kind of approach what sort of personality you have, and what sort of approach you would bring to the job. So it's much more than just knowing who you are and what you've done, what you know and what you've done, but also who you are. And there are many ways of testing that kind of thing, and organizations do that. But yeah, so it's a question of finding a Remco person who not only has the ability to understand the relationships between pay and performance, and between metrics and long-term performance, and the contributions of different forms of stakeholder value to long-term financial performance, which is really complex, but also has the ability and the willingness to go out and ask the right questions and to learn.
Thanks, Tim and Ronel. I'm going to ask 3 questions now. I've plonked them together as I think they do relate to each other. The one is around what is the best practice with respect to vesting periods for long-term incentives? And then related to that, Johan asks, given the current COVID conditions, how does this impact long-term incentives? And Parmi's asked a question around, could you give us a sense of what have you been seeing in the market with regards to executive pay linkage to purpose, specifically during this COVID pandemic and its related impact on business and economy? So Ronel and Tim, those are the 3 questions around long-term investments and then the link between executive pay and purpose during these current times.
So let me tackle the first 2. With regard to the best practice on vesting, I'm always hesitant to talk about best practice when it comes to the vesting of long-term incentives, because I think there's common practice. Best practice is really what works for the organization in terms of their particular industry, their development cycle, their maturity, etc. Where I think common practice is what you see in the market. And in my view, the most common practice for vesting periods in the long-term incentive plans in South Africa, as well as in the UK, Europe, and in the USA, still is 3 years. We're starting to see a lot of pressure on organizations to increase that vesting period. Tim has also mentioned 5 to 7 period is what he started to pick up in the research. So there's pressure to increase the 3 years, because what we've seen over the last couple of years is that so much happens and executives walk away with loads of money, but then leave behind companies where they've just destroyed so much value. So at the moment, my view is that 3 years is probably the most prevalent horizon. What has happened over the last couple of years is that organizations have countered that with the introduction of minimum shareholding requirements. If you have those minimum shareholding requirements, you typically don't necessarily need then the longer vesting period. But if I have a crystal ball and I can look into it, I think we're probably starting to head for more 5-year vesting periods. In terms of COVID-19 and long-term incentives, so there's certainly 3 things that we're seeing around the world that's happening at the moment. It also depends on your year end. If your year end is December, then you've just probably had a vesting in March, so you have a bit more time. And your question is what's going to happen now in the next year. If you have a June vesting, companies that would now typically do their assessment of performance or the allocation of annual awards, they're the ones that are currently stuck in a dilemma in terms of what now needs to be done. So we see 3 things. The one thing is that the date for the annual award is being moved out until some time of normality sets in and companies have an idea more or less of what is going to happen in the next year. The second thing is that the award date remains, but that the target setting is being postponed by, say, 6 months. So you get your award, we're only going to tell you what corporate performance targets will be set in sort of the next 6 months until we understand the full impact of COVID-19. And the third thing is a lot of debate at the moment around the award price. We've seen stock markets plunge around the world. Some of them have recovered quite nicely again of late. But there are many organizations that still have very depressed share prices. And the question is, do you now issue the awards at those low prices? So if you have obviously a zero priced award, then your award size, say you would give 50,000 Rand of shares, you would divide that by the share price, which will give you a very large number of shares in comparison to, for example, last year. So do you average out the share price? Do you put a max on the award in case you have some windfall gains over the next couple of years? Those are the matters that organizations are struggling with at the moment. So because companies are right in the middle of this think tank, we're not sure yet what's going to pan out. But those are three of the leading sort of thinking patterns. And if you want to have a look at one of the best guidance that we've seen was published by the Investment Association in the UK, and it is on their website as well. Tim, do you want to tackle the third question?
Yeah, just that point about linking executive pay to purpose. I would say this is probably still quite a gap, and I would think that companies are struggling to get a hold on it. And I think also there's the issue of the role and influence of institutional investors, because if you think, as I mentioned, BlackRock, or take the local ones, Allen Gray, Investec, Coronation, whoever you like, their role is to manage and grow the pension money that you as an individual saver have put into that organization. So if they are being told to think about things that may detract from that objective in the long term, I would think they're going to resist it. And that is exactly what this proposed draft legislation in the UK, in the US is all about. It was put out by the Department of Labor, and they are simply saying that in terms of the Pension Funds Act, the role of a pension fund is to make the future of their pensioners secure. It's not to change society. So, and that's part of the issue, because some people think that big business's objective is to change society. And I don't think that we've got total clarity on that. And if you were to look, and I've looked at a few integrated reports, remuneration reports, how many companies actually do tie non-financial metrics to executive remuneration, it's still relatively few. You know, things like safety, you'll always find there. And one company that I looked at had a short-term incentive, and they had a qualifier for it. And they simply said, if you don't meet your BEE objective, we're going to reduce your payout of the short-term incentive by 15%. So it was a qualifier. So, but other than that, some of the metrics that we put into that table, I would say companies are starting to think about it. Institutional investors are thinking about it, but we still have some way to go.
Thanks, Tim. A question from Osilia. She says, how do you view the use of the Ebitda margin as a financial metric? She says companies tend to use this entirely for determining the bonus pool. And just what's your view on that?
Okay, Ebitda margin, all right. I cover that quite a lot in my course. And it's actually quite interesting. I ask a simple question, and the delegates, and I say, what is Ebitda? And everybody tells me what it stands for. And I said, no, I don't want to know what it stands for. I want to know what it is. And it's actually interesting that it's become one of these things that, like EPS, it's just become a commonly used measure. And I don't believe that people always understand its relevance in a particular situation. Ebitda has, first of all, it's not governed by GAAP or IFRS, so you can adjust Ebitda, you can make it anything you like. It's a little bit like, you know, headline earnings per share. It's not governed by any rules. And so you can have exclusions or inclusions. But an Ebitda is really a figure that lenders care about. because they want to know, are you generating sufficient operating cash flow to cover your debt payments? So in that situation, it's a very useful measure. But EBITDA and EBITDA margin, you need to interrogate it. I'm not saying it's relevant or not relevant to any particular company, but you need to understand exactly what it is and interpret it in your organization. So if you have a company that needs frequent and heavy capital investments, in other words, you've got a lot of depreciation, or if you're in a company that does acquisitions a lot and you've got a lot of amortization to write off, and you go and use EBITDA, which leaves those two numbers out, I don't think you're giving a true reflection of what the company has to contend with.
Thanks, Tim. Nanda's posed a question, first a statement saying there is a definite disconnect between the executive remuneration and other levels below the C-suite level. What does the stats say about value being created for the company and its stakeholders versus pure greed? And what about the dwell time of these executives within the company that drives short-term focus rather than long-term focus? So that's one question. Khateles asks a question around how do you strike the balance between remunerating executives based on organizational purpose and what the market scales advise us, or where benchmarks provide us certain figures. So maybe those two questions together, Tim and Ronel.
Yeah, so the first one really has got a whole lot of questions in one. The disconnect between executive pay and pay below the executive is certainly an issue. I think inequality is a global concern. It's something which actively needs to be addressed by companies. But I also think that shareholders in particular and broader stakeholders are not that concerned with large executive payouts if the organization does really well. And I define really well in terms of what Tim is also describing in terms of purpose. So it's not just in financial metrics, but in fact, in a balanced scorecard of different financial and non-financial metrics. So if they perform really well and there's good value derived for shareholders and for other stakeholders, then typically there's little concern about executive pay. I think the issue that we really have to consider and find a way around is the fact that we have such large, particularly in South Africa, levels of unemployment, and very low levels of minimum wage. Minimum wage, which is significantly below what is considered to be a living wage, where somebody can have at least a decent lifestyle, frugal but decent, and that is where we now need to start looking at in order to close that gap. So there's a number of questions there, Vicky. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to address all of them, but I do think that pay equality is something which organizations need to look at very importantly over the next while. Tim?
Yeah, and you know, a lot of that's covered under the heading in Principle 14 of King 4, where they talk about fair and responsible remuneration, fair, responsible, and transparent. And they don't really tell you exactly what to do. They just say, in your context, what do you believe is fair? What do you believe is responsible? And again, if you go and look at remuneration reports of big organizations, and I can think of a couple, they actually give their stance on responsible remuneration and fair remuneration. And they talk about no racial or gender inequality. They talk about equal pay for equal work. They talk about all that kind of thing. But they also say a useful way of closing a pay gap is not necessarily to cut the pay of the senior executive, because that's not going to work. It's rather to justify increasing the pay of the lower people. Now, if you've got a lower paid person who doesn't add a lot of value to the organization, it's very difficult to justify a wage increase. But if you were to develop that person and make them, let's just say, more useful, more productive, more ability, have a high ability to contribute, then you can justify paying them more. And that is the stance that some organizations do, is they look for ways to make employees more valuable so they can pay them more, and that in turn then cuts the pay gap and reduces inequality. Vicky?
Thanks, Tim and Ronel. We are nearing the end, so I'm just going to do one question from Jathin. I hope I'm saying your name right. And I'm just going to ask, he's asked a number of questions, but I'm going to ask the first one. And that's around whether there are any practical implications that income inequality in SA should have on remuneration structures or policies in companies. I think that was a nice one, just around how should we take into account all the things that you mentioned this morning when structuring your REM policies in a company.
Yeah, I think Tim has said it so well. You know, in terms of Principle 14, also remuneration committees are having to consider the executive remuneration in the context of overall employee remuneration, and therefore it is their focus should definitely not just be on executive remuneration. And so from a policy perspective, the remuneration committee should absolutely concern itself with the setting of the minimum wage in an organization. So what is that minimum wage? Are they comfortable that employees can live on that lower end of the income scale? And as Tim said, what can be done to also, over a period of time, build a career ladder for employees that will enable them to, in fact, build a career with the organization and significantly enhance their income. So I see a link to that particular question also. Is there thoughts on the capping of executive remuneration? My personal belief is that it doesn't really make much of a difference. We've seen that in the UK, and it certainly has not at all helped in terms of reducing inequality. Quite to the contrary, it actually had the opposite effect. So I think organizations need to go and make sure that from an employee perspective, they look at this holistically. And also from an executive pay point of view, you must make sure that you can justify all components of remuneration from a base salary, a benefits, a short-term and a long-term incentive perspective. And that there is sufficient scrutiny of all those elements before those payouts are approved. Tim?
And one thing, thanks Ronel, one thing we've seen is that the remit of a Remco is getting broader and broader, particularly maybe in other countries. Like in the UK, for example, there was a proposal out a while ago, and it effectively said that Remco should be the custodian, I suppose, or have oversight, not only of executive pay, which is traditionally what they've done, but of pay right across the organization. And not just that, but also the HR practices that go with employees. There's been quite a kickback on that. The Institute of Directors in the UK said that they absolutely don't agree. You're changing the whole nature of the Remco from what it was set up to be to something that's, you know, much more than that. But I think the point is that this whole thing on fair and responsible remuneration has to be thought of by somebody. Somebody's got to have oversight of it, and I think companies are taking that seriously. Thanks, Vicky.
Thank you, Tim and Ronel, for joining us this morning and giving us your time and officially launching our paper 10 this morning. As mentioned, the paper is available on our website. Fusani has put it on the chat, the link as well. Everyone will get the slides and we'll have all the links available to them to download it. So I hope everyone enjoyed this morning, and a little bit of a teaser. I know it's not the usual amount of time we would normally spend for our paper launches, but I hope, and I'm sure Ronel and Tim, you both shared some incredible insights, and from what I can see from the chats, it's been very useful and practical. So thank you for this morning. Please go have a read through the paper, and if you do have any questions, you're more than welcome to pose this to the IoDSA, and we'll post your questions to Tim and Ronel, or even the Remco forum as well. From my side, I think we've gotten some really good questions, and I know we haven't managed to go through all of them, but we will have a look at it, and we will actually pose some of these questions at our next forum meeting, and actually look at how else we can potentially answer some of the questions, or even look at what other future guidance papers we can put together, given some of the questions that were raised this morning. So thank you, everybody. Tim and Ronel, is there any last words that you would like to leave for the attendees?
I think what you measure is what you get, and what you pay for is what you get. And I think if organizations start to spend more time on linking their remuneration targets to their purpose, they have a much better chance, in fact, to realize that purpose. That's it from me. Thank you, Vicky.
And yeah, all I can say is we live in very interesting times. as I said, I've got a remuneration course, and I change that course every single time I present it, because there's always something new in the world of remuneration, executive remuneration. And it's always this balance of how do you link executive remuneration with the long-term fortunes of the company and all of its stakeholders. And that is not a simple matter. So our Remuneration Committee members and board members need to think about that and read. I mean, there's so much available. There is so much information available for absolutely no charge. And I think it's your duty to make sure that you understand the issues and you're able to adapt them to the context in which you operate.
Thank you, everyone. Please complete our survey, and in the option box for future topics, you're more than welcome to put topic ideas for our forum itself in terms of what else you would like guidance on from a REM governance perspective. So do please put your thoughts and topics there, because it's a great way for us to record what our members and the public are wanting from the forum, so that we can ensure we're also addressing your specific needs as REM committee members. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. I will see everyone again next week, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, Vicky. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.